This content presents World War II historical events for educational purposes only, based on documented records to honor those who served and provide historical insight. This does not glorify violence, promote hatred, or spread misinformation. Viewer discretion advised.
The gates of Dachau swung open on April 29, 1945, and with them the gates of hell itself seemed to yawn before us. I was 23 years old, a rifleman with the 45th Infantry Division, and nothing in my training, nothing in the sanitized briefings we'd received, could have prepared me for what lay beyond that iron threshold. The stench hit us first, a wall of death so thick you could taste it on your tongue, feel it coating your throat like oil. My sergeant, a hardman who'd seen action since North Africa, fell to his knees and vomited. I wanted to look away, to close my eyes, to pretend that the skeletal figures stumbling toward us with outstretched arms were shadows, phantoms, anything but human beings. But I couldn't. I owed them my witness. The living looked like the dead, and the dead were stacked like cordwood, mountains of corpses, naked and twisted, their faces frozen in eternal agony. I saw a man, if you could call him that anymore, weighing perhaps 70 pounds, reach out to touch my sleeve with fingers like twigs. His eyes were enormous in his shrunken face, and in them I saw something that would haunt me forever. Not hatred, not even relief, but a kind of terrible questioning, as if asking, "Why did you take so long?" I had no answer then. I have no answer now. We distributed what rations we had, but our food was too rich for stomachs that had forgotten what nourishment was. Some died from eating. Even our mercy killed them. That night I sat with my back against a barracks wall and wept for the first time since childhood. Around me, hardened soldiers did the same. These men who had stormed beaches and fought through hedgerows, reduced to sobbing children by the systematic cruelty we'd uncovered. We had been fighting against an army, or so we thought. Now we understood. We had been fighting against something far worse, an ideology that could transform human beings into numbers, into ash, into a problem to be solved through industrial murder. The photographs we took, the films we shot, seemed inadequate, almost insulting in their inability to capture the full horror. How do you document the annihilation of the human soul? The dead couldn't speak, but they screamed nonetheless. In the crematoriums, we found hair mountains of it, sorted by color. Shoes, thousands upon thousands of them, tiny children's shoes mixed with adults, gold teeth extracted with pliers. Glasses, suitcases labeled with names that would never return home. Each object was a life, a story, a universe of love and hope and dreams crushed under the boot of madness. I picked up a small doll, its button eyes still bright, lying in the mud near the gas chambers. Some little girl had clutched this doll, believing her mother's lies that they were simply going to shower. I put the doll in my pack. I still have it. I need to remember that these weren't statistics. They were Sophie and Jakob and Sarah. They were real. As we moved through Germany in those final weeks of war, liberating camp after camp, the pattern repeated with suffocating consistency. Buchenwald, Mauthausen, Bergen-Belsen, each name now synonymous with humanity's capacity for darkness. The German civilians living nearby always claimed ignorance, but the smell of burning flesh carries 4 miles. They knew. They had to have known. And even if they hadn't seen inside the fences, they had watched their Jewish neighbors disappear, watched the trains packed with humanity rumble past their windows, watched and said nothing. Their silence was a kind of murder, too. I began to understand that the guilt didn't rest solely with the SS officers in camp. It was collective. spread like a stain across an entire nation that had chosen comfort over courage, order over conscience. When they told us we'd be part of the security detail for the war crimes trials in Nuremberg, I felt something I had felt since before the war. A sense of purpose that was yearned about survival. We had spent months witnessing the aftermath of atrocity, but now, finally, there would be accountability. The city of Nuremberg itself was a cruel irony. This place where Hitler had held his massive rallies, where hundreds of thousands had raised their arms in salute to genocide, now reduced to rubble. The Palace of Justice stood almost alone among the ruins, a marble monument to the idea that even in the darkest times, justice could prevail. I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. The prisoners arrived in November 1945, and I stood guard as they were processed. These were the architects of the nightmare, the men whose signatures had condemned millions. Hermann Göring, once Hitler's designated successor, now a deflatus addict in a shabby uniform stripped of its medals. Rudolf Hess, with his hollow eyes and theatrical amnesia. Julius Streicher, the pornographer of hate, who had poisoned minds with his vile newspaper. Hans Frank, who had governed Poland like a personal slaughterhouse. Looking at them, I felt a dissonance that made my head spin. These were the monsters who had engineered genocide. They looked so ordinary, so disappointingly human. Evil, I realized with chilling clarity, doesn't announce itself with horns and fangs. It wears a suit and tie. It files paperwork in trip. It goes home to dinner and kisses its children good night. Göring was the worst of them, swaggering even in defeat, treating the trial like a stage for his performance. He would smirk at the prosecutors, joke with his co-defendants, play the role of loyal soldier just following orders. But I saw something else when the films from the camps were shown. We all watched the footage in a courtroom. The lights dimmed, the projector whirred, and on the screen appeared the very scenes I had witnessed firsthand. The piles of corpses, the skeletal survivors, the gas chambers, the ovens. I watched the defendants' faces in the dim light. Some looked away, some covered their eyes, but Göring stared straight ahead, and on his face was not remorse or shock, but calculation. He was wondering, I think, if he could spin this somehow, if his legendary cunning could find a way to minimize, to justify, to explain away the unexpected. The trial itself was a marvel of order imposed on chaos, a cathedral of process erected over an abyss of madness. The prosecutors, led by the American Robert Jackson, presented a case that was simultaneously simple and infinitely complex. The evidence was overwhelming. Documents signed by the defendants' orders for mass murder in their own. Handwriting testimony from survivors whose voices shook the marble halls, films that made even hardened. Journalists flee the courtroom to vomit in the hallways. The defense attempted various strategies. Some claimed they didn't know. Some claimed they were following orders. Some, like Streicher, seemed to revel in their hatred even now, spewing anti-Semitic venom from the witness stand as if unable to help themselves. I began to understand that this trial was about more than punishing individual criminals. It was humanity's attempt to write a new chapter, to establish that certain acts were so heinous that no order, no law, no national sovereignty could excuse them. The concept of crimes against humanity was being born in that courtroom, a recognition that some boundaries are universal, that some evils are everyone's concern. But I also wondered, in my darkest moments standing guard in the cold corridors, whether justice could ever truly be served. How do you punish the unpunishable? How do you balance the scales when one side holds 12 million murdered souls? 10 hangings, 20, 100 would, any number equaled the weight of what had been done. Or was this trial merely a ritual, necessary but ultimately symbolic, a way for us to pretend that monsters could be contained by laws and verdicts? As the weeks turned to months, I found myself studying the defendants with an intensity that bordered on obsession. During the long hours of guard duty, I would watch them when they thought no one was looking, trying to understand how human beings could orchestrate such inhuman acts. Göring remained defiant to the end, his intelligence undeniable even as he used it in service of self-preservation. He would debate the prosecutors, twist words, find loopholes in logic. In another life, perhaps he could have been a great attorney. Instead, he had been the second most powerful man in a regime built on murder, the creator of the Gestapo, the architect of the Final Solutions economic infrastructure. When Jackson Krauss examined him, it was like watching two titans clash, except one was fighting for human civilization and the other for the right to claim he had only been doing his job. Rudolf Hess was different, a strange hollow man who claimed to remember nothing, his amnesia conveniently selective. Some thought he was faking, others that he had genuinely fractured under the weight of what he'd been part of. I saw him sometimes in his cell, rocking back and forth, talking to himself in whispers. Whether his madness was real or performed didn't matter much to me. He had been there at the beginning, one of Hitler's oldest companions, a true believer who had helped birth the ideology that justified genocide. His mind might be broken now, but his hands were still stained. Hans Frank, the butcher of Poland, had found religion in his cell, converting to Catholicism and claiming remorse. He kept a diary which the prosecution used to devastating effect, his own words condemning him page by page. 3 million Polish Jews had died under his governance, and now he wanted forgiveness. I wondered if God could grant what human justice could not. Albert Speer presented himself as the penitent technocrat, the architect who claimed he'd been seduced by Hitler's charisma and blinded by his own ambition. He was the only defendant to accept general responsibility, though he still claimed ignorance of the Final Solution's full scope. This made him dangerous in a different way. If the others were obviously guilty, monsters we could point to and say never again, Speer was the mirror held up to anyone who ever advanced their career by ignoring warning signs. Whoever put ambition over conscience, he was the willing cog in the machine, the talented man who lent his gifts to evil, and claimed later he simply hadn't asked questions. I looked at him and wondered how different he really was from the engineers who designed the crematoriums, or the railroad workers who scheduled the death trains, or the factory owners who used slave labor. When do you cross from complicity to guilt? Julius Streicher was pure venom in human form, the editor of Der Stürmer, a newspaper so vile that it made Nazi propaganda look subtle by comparison. He had never personally killed anyone, never commanded a death camp, but his words had poisoned a nation, had made the unthinkable thinkable, had transformed neighbors into enemies and eventually into corpses. He showed no remorse, couldn't even pretend to. Even the other defendants distanced themselves from him, embarrassed by his crude but he had been useful to them once, normalizing hate, making genocide a policy rather than a crime. Words, I learned, could be weapons as deadly as any gun. Ideas could murder millions, and the men who spread those ideas were as guilty as those who pulled the triggers. Watching them day after day, I came to a terrible realization. These men were not aberrations, but warnings. They were educated, cultured, intelligent in many cases. They had families and hobbies and dreams. They weren't born evil. They had chosen it, or allowed themselves to be seduced by it, or simply failed to resist it when resistance required courage. The true horror of Nuremberg wasn't that monsters existed. It was that monsters looked like everyone else, that evil was banal and bureaucratic, that the path to genocide was paved with paperwork and yes-men, and people who convinced themselves they were just doing their jobs. If it could happen there, in Germany, the land of poets and philosophers, then it could happen anywhere. It could happen here. That was the lesson I took from those faces, staring at them across the courtroom. Eternal vigilance is the price of civilization, and the moment we forget that, the moment we become comfortable, Eva walks in through the open door. The survivors who took the stand haunted the courtroom more effectively than any ghost. They came, these remnants of destroyed worlds, and spoke in voices that shook, despite their evident effort to remain composed. I watched a man named Samuel, once a doctor in Warsaw, describe the selection process at Auschwitz. He had survived because Mengele needed someone with medical training for his experiments. His wife and 3 children had gone to the gas chambers within an hour of arrival. He described it clinically, almost detached, until the prosecutor asked him what his youngest daughter's last words to him were. The question broke him, and he wept on the stand for 10 minutes while the court sat in absolute silence. His daughter had asked if there would be chocolate where they were going. She was 6 years old. I saw Göring examine his fingernails during this testimony, and I wanted to leap over the barrier and strangle him with my bare hands. A French resistance fighter named Marie testified about Ravensbrück, the women's camp where she'd been sent for hiding Jewish children. She described medical experiments, forced sterilizations, babies ripped from their mothers and killed in front of them. She had survived 22 months in that hell, watched friends die of disease and despair, endured torture that left her body scarred forever. But what stayed with me was her description of the camp orchestra, the way the SS made prisoners play cheerful music as other prisoners marched to their deaths, the perversion of it, the cruel mockery, using beauty itself as an instrument of torture. When she finished, even the judges looked shaken. The defendants stared at the floor or whispered to their lawyers, unable or unwilling to face her. They showed more films. A Soviet prosecutor presented footage from Auschwitz, from Majdanek, from the industrial nature of the killing became undeniable. This wasn't war. This wasn't even ordinary cruelty. This was a factory system designed for death, complete with timetables and quotas and efficiency reports. We saw footage of SS officers sorting through belongings, mountains of suitcases and clothes and shoes being catalogued like inventory. We saw the gas chambers themselves, the scratch marks on the walls where victims had clawed in their final moments. We saw experiments on living people, footage that the Nazis themselves had filmed with clinical detachment. Some of it was too much to show in open court. The judges watched it in private and emerged looking 20 years older. A Hungarian Jew named David described the death marches of 1945 when the SS evacuated camps ahead of the Soviet advance. Thousands had died on the roads, shot for falling behind or simply collapsing from starvation and exhaustion. He had survived by eating snow and stealing scraps from pigs when the guards weren't looking. He had seen a mother shot for carrying her child, seen men beaten to death for asking for water. The defendant's lawyers tried to discredit him, suggesting his memory was faulty, that trauma had confused him. But David had kept a mental diary, memorized dates and names and places. He recited them like a litany, an act of defiance against those who would erase what had happened. His testimony went on for 3 days. By the end, even some of the defense attorneys looked sick. These testimonies transformed the trial from an abstract legal proceeding into something rawly, painfully human. The defendants could hide behind claims of following orders, of not knowing, of being soldiers in a war, but the survivors stripped away those lies with their presence, their scars, their refusal to let the world forget. They were the voices of millions who couldn't speak, the witnesses to atrocities that the perpetrators wanted to bury. I stood guard and listened, and with each testimony, I felt the weight of responsibility settle heavier on my shoulders. We had liberated the camps. Now we had to make sure the world remembered why such liberation had been necessary. We had to bear witness to the witnesses, carry their stories forward, ensure that these faces of evil never became comfortable again, never became normalized, never became just another footnote in history. October 1st, 1946. The day of judgment, the courtroom was packed with journalists, observers, survivors who had traveled across continents to see this moment. Outside, crowds gathered despite the rain, waiting for news. I stood at my post behind the defendants' dock, watching the backs of their heads as the judges filed in. For nearly a year, we had listened to evidence, watched films, heard testimonies. Now came the reckoning. The president of the tribunal, Lord Justice Geoffrey Lawrence, began to read. The verdicts came one by one, and with each pronouncement, a piece of history solidified into permanent record. Guilty, guilty, guilty. The word echoed through the marble hall like a hammer striking stone. Göring was found guilty on all counts. He sat motionless as his crimes were enumerated. Conspiracy to wage aggressive war, war crimes, crimes against humanity. The litany went on and on. Years of evil compressed into legal language. When the judge pronounced sentence death by hanging, Göring finally showed emotion, not remorse. Anger? He had wanted a firing squad, the death of a soldier. Hanging was for common criminals. The irony was perfect and lost on him. Hess received life imprisonment, his amnesia saving him from the rope. Frank, the penitent murderer, heard his death sentence and crossed himself. Streicher's verdict was met with visible satisfaction from the survivors in the gallery. Even his fellow defendants seemed relieved he would hang, but there were acquittals too, and these felt like failures. Schacht, the financial wizard who had helped fund the Nazi war machine, walked free. Von Papen, the conservative politician who had helped Hitler into power, was found not guilty. The tribunal's reasoning was sound. They had been part of the conspiracy to commit war crimes, specific liberated felt. Wrong, nonetheless. These men had enabled everything. Without them, without their respectability and connections and financial genius, Hitler might have remained a failed beer hall agitator. But the law is narrow, and justice broader than any courtroom can contain. I watched them leave as free men, and wondered how they would live with themselves, whether freedom without accountability was its own kind of prison. The sentences were carried out on October 16, 1946, in the prison gymnasium. I was there, part of the security detail, watching as the condemned men were led one by one to the gallows. It was not a clean death. Some of the hangings were botched, taking minutes instead of seconds. Frank went first, and I heard him pray as the hood went over his head. "Streicher!" shouted Heil Hitler. Before the trap dropped, one by one, they fell. And with each death, I felt not satisfaction, but a profound emptiness. This was necessary. This was right. But it couldn't bring back the dead. It couldn't undo what had been done. It was merely the period at the end of a sentence written in blood. Göring cheated the hangman, swallowing a cyanide capsule smuggled into his cell hours before his scheduled execution. Even in death, he needed to maintain control to have the last word. I was angry at first, feeling robbed of the closure his hanging would have provided. But later, I understood it didn't matter. The trial had never really been about these men specifically. It was about establishing principles. That aggressive war is a crime. That following orders is not an absolute defense. That crimes against humanity exist and will be punished. Nuremberg created the framework for modern international law, for the Geneva Convention's expansion, for the concept that some acts are so heinous they concern all of humanity. The verdicts mattered less than the trial itself, the gathering of evidence, the public exposure of evil. We had held a mirror up to the abyss, and now everyone could see what lurked within. I wrote my first letter home from Nuremberg in November 1945, shortly after the trial began. My hands shook as I held the pen, trying to explain to my mother what I had seen, what I was seeing, what it all meant. How do you describe the weight of witnessing history? How do you tell someone you love that you now carry images in your head that will never leave that? Every night you dream of skeletal hands reaching toward you, of mountains of shoes, of children's toys, lying in the mud. I wrote 3 pages and then burned them. Some truths are too heavy to send home. Instead, I wrote about the weather, about the other soldiers, about anything except the real war one was fighting. No war against forgetting, against the comfortable lie that such things couldn't happen, hadn't happened. My buddy Tommy from Michigan sat with me one night, both of us on break from guard duty, sharing a cigarette in the cold October. He had been at Buchenwald with me, had seen the same things, carried the same nightmares. "My girl back home," he said. "She wants to know when I'm coming back. What do I tell her? The guy she kissed goodbye doesn't exist anymore. He died in that camp, looking at those faces, those bodies. How do I explain that I'm a different person now?" I had no answer because I was asking myself the same question. The war in Europe had ended, but the war inside us was just beginning, this battle between wanting to forget and knowing we never could, never should. We talked sometimes about what would come after. Once the trial ended and we went home, would people believe us? Would they care? The footage from the camps had been shown in theaters back in the States. But would it make a difference? People have a remarkable capacity for denial, for looking away from uncomfortable truths. We worried that in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, the Holocaust would become just another historical footnote, that people would minimize it, claim it was exaggerated, use it for political points without understanding its weight. That fear haunted me more than the nightmares. What if we bore witness and nobody listened? I received a letter from my younger brother, still in high school, asking if the war had been worth it. The question angered me at first. How dare he ask such a thing from the safety of our hometown, having never seen what I'd seen? But then I realized he was right to ask. We needed to ask. Millions had died. Entire cities had been destroyed. And for what? Had we really made the world safer, or just paused the cycle of violence for a generation? Nuremberg suggested we might be creating something new, a world where international law mattered, where tyrants couldn't hide behind sovereignty. But I had my doubts. The trial was trying 22 men. What about the thousands who had implemented their orders? What about the millions who had looked away? In my final letter from Nuremberg, written days after the executions, I tried to articulate something I'd been grappling with for months. We had won the war. We had liberated the camps. We had put the perpetrators on trial and mostly held them accountable. But victory felt hollow because the costs had been so high and the lessons so terrible. We had learned that human beings are capable of anything, that civilization is a thin veneer over something dark and violent that evil doesn't announce itself with thunder and lightning, but arrives in small compromises in silence, when courage is needed in the choice to follow orders rather than question them. Nuremberg was humanity's attempt to say never again. But as I sealed that letter and watched it disappear into the military postal system, I wondered if humans were capable of learning such lessons, or if we were doomed to repeat these cycles of violence forever, each generation convinced that this time they would be different. The courtroom emptied, the defendants were executed or imprisoned, and Nuremberg slowly returned to being just another German city struggling to rebuild from ruins. But the trial's impact rippled outward in ways we couldn't fully understand at the time. It established precedents that would echo through decades. The Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, the war crimes, tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda, the International Criminal Court. Every time a dictator or general or bureaucrat of death faced justice, they faced it in part because of what happened in that Palace of Justice in 1945 and 1946. The idea that some acts are crimes against all humanity, that sovereignty is not absolute, that following orders is not a defense's concepts, now seemingly obvious, were revolutionary then. I left Nuremberg in early 1947, returning to a country that seemed alien to me. Everyone was celebrating, embracing peacetime prosperity, moving forward. And they should have. Life goes on. But I found it difficult to connect with people who hadn't seen what I'd seen. They would complain about rationing or prices or politics, and I would think about starving prisoners grateful for a scrap of moldy bread. They would talk about the Germans with casual prejudice, and I would remember the survivors telling us that hate was what had started it all. I felt disconnected, watching life from behind glass, carrying knowledge that made normal existence seem both precious and fragile. I became a teacher, eventually. It seemed like the only thing I could do with what I'd witnessed. If I couldn't make people understand through personal testimony, maybe I could teach the next generation to recognize the warning signs, to stand up when standing up was needed, to never let comfort override conscience. Every year, I would teach the unit on World War II, and every year, I would watch my students' faces as they learned about the Holocaust for the first time. Some would cry, some would become angry, some would refuse to believe that such things were possible. People aren't like that, they'd say. And I would have to tell them, yes, they are. Given the right circumstances, the right propaganda, the right fears, humans are capable of anything. I kept the doll I'd found at Dachau in my desk drawer. Sometimes students would notice it and ask about it, and I would tell them the story of a little girl who had carried it to her death, believing she was just going to take a shower. The doll was a reminder that statistics are people, that 6 million is not a number, but 6 million individual tragedies, each one as real and devastating as if it had happened to someone you loved. Some of my fellow teachers thought I was too graphic, that I traumatized students with these stories. But I still believe that the greater trauma would be forgetting, would be letting these deaths become meaningless, would be failing to learn the lessons written in ash and blood. The phrase, never again, became a motto, almost a cliché. But clichés become clichés because they're repeated, and they're repeated because they need to be. Every generation must learn anew that freedom is not natural, that civilization requires constant vigilance, that evil is not some external force, but a potential that lives in every human heart. Nuremberg was our attempt to codify this knowledge, to build legal barriers against humanity's worst impulses. Did it work? Partially. Genocides still happen, Tyrants still rise. Hate still finds fertile ground. But because of Nuremberg, they can't claim ignorance of international law. They can't say that crimes against humanity are just internal affairs. They can't hide behind orders. The standard was set. Now it's up to each generation to uphold it, to remember, to refuse to look away when looking away is comfortable. I am 97 years old now, writing these words in a hand that shakes more from age than from memory, though memory still has the power to make me tremble. Most of the men I served with are gone, the survivors we liberated, the ones who testified at Nuremberg. They're gone too. Soon there will be no living witnesses to what happened, only words on pages and films in archives and the testimony of those of us who saw. That's why I write this, why I've spent my life teaching, speaking, refusing to let the past rest comfortably. Because once we're gone, it will be easier for people to deny, to minimize, to claim it wasn't that bad or didn't happen at all. Already I see it happening. This erosion of memory, this comfortable forgetfulness. The doll sits on my desk still, its button eyes, as bright as the day I found it in the mud 75 years ago. Students visit sometimes, college students now, working on their theses about the war, about Nuremberg, about memory and justice. They ask good questions. They're earnest and intelligent and deeply concerned about making a better world. And I tell them what I told my own students for 40 years. The Nazis didn't start with gas chambers. They started with words, with propaganda, with dehumanizing a group of people until they became not people, but problems. They started with small compromises, with good people saying nothing, with the corrosion of democratic norms in the name of order and security. I tell them about the faces of the defendants at Nuremberg, how ordinary they looked, how human. I tell them that's the most frightening lesson of all, that monsters look like everyone else, that evil is banal and bureaucratic, that the path from civilization to genocide is shorter than anyone wants to believe. I tell them that eternal vigilance is not a cliché but a requirement, that democracy dies when good people decide that politics doesn't matter, or that their vote doesn't count, or that surely someone else will stand up. I tell them that never again is not a promise but a choice, one that has to be made every single day by every single person. The Nuremberg Trials established that there are some acts so heinous that they concern all of humanity, that justice can reach across borders, that following orders is not an absolute defense. These principles seem obvious now, but they were revolutionary then, created in the aftermath of humanity's darkest hour. The trials weren't perfect. Justice never is. But they represented an attempt to create a world governed by law rather than by might, to establish that all people have certain inviolable rights, that there are lines that cannot be crossed without consequence. Every war crimes trial since has drawn from Nuremberg's precedent. Every time a dictator falls and faces justice, it's because of what we established in that courtroom. As I write these final words, I think about all the voices that were silenced, the millions who never got to testify, who never saw justice, who died in gas chambers and mass graves in forgotten places across Europe. I think about the survivors who rebuilt their lives despite unimaginable trauma, who had the courage to testify, to remember, to ensure the world knew what had been done. I think about my fellow soldiers, the men I served with, who liberated camps and stood guard at trials and carried these memories for a lifetime. We bore witness. That was our duty and our burden. Now I pass that burden to you. Whoever reads this, remember, question, stand up, speak out. Never let comfort override conscience. Never let fear justify cruelty. Never forget that civilization is fragile, that democracy requires participation, that silence in the face of evil is its own form of evil. The dead cannot speak. We must speak for them. The victims cannot demand justice. We must demand it in their name. This is the legacy of Nuremberg, and this is my final testimony. Never again is now. It's always now. And it's up to you. The lessons of Nuremberg remain urgent today. Genocide still occurs. Authoritarianism still rises. Hate still finds fertile ground. But we are not powerless. Each of us has the responsibility to stand against injustice, to speak for those who cannot speak, to remember what happens when good people remain silent. Visit Holocaust museums and memorials. Support organizations that document and prevent genocide. Teach these stories to younger generations. Vote for leaders who uphold human rights and international law. Challenge hate speech and propaganda wherever you encounter it. Most importantly, never convince yourself that such things cannot happen again, or that they only happen over there, or that one person cannot make a difference. History turns on the choices of individuals. You are that individual. Choose memory. Choose action. The ghosts of 12 million murdered souls demand nothing less, and the future depends on whether we have learned their lessons. Never again starts with you today, now.